Good day to you. Like a lot of people in the world right now, I'm trying to figure out what it's going to take to fix the Russia-Ukraine situation. And I'm trying to get some insight into what Vladimir Putin wants. That's what I'm trying to figure out. So this morning, I was looking at my phone, I was scrolling through my apps, I went to CNN, and I saw a photograph of a video that had been recorded, which was an interview with the president of Finland. Now, I've been to Finland. It shares a huge border with Russia. I've been craving some kind of insight into exactly what is happening and why Putin is doing what he's doing. Insight other than what I'm hearing from regular media sources. So I was interested to hear from this Finnish president. And he used the word NATO in his answer. I'll let you go and watch the video if you want on your own. It's one of the most informative videos, one of the most informative interviews I've seen on the current situation between Russia and the Ukraine. But he mentioned the word NATO, and that's a trigger word for me because I'm trying to hear if NATO is going to be a red line for Vladimir Putin, that if a NATO country gets involved, then there's going to be war against all NATO countries, one of which is the U.S. So in a way, I got pleasure. Can you imagine that? I got pleasure from watching this interview with the Finnish president, and when NATO was mentioned, it excited me. I felt excited in a way, a pleasureful way, because I was getting to hear something that I was listening for. And so that introduces our subject for today, which is all about pleasure, as we take on Chapter 12 in the text. And our chapter today is on a word that may seem strange in the beginning. It's called erotic. Erotic analysis, to be specific. That's our framework for today. We're taking on erotic analysis, which is all about pleasure. You may think that it's strictly sexual pleasure that this chapter has a lot to do with. It is not, although sexual pleasure is definitely one of the kinds of pleasures that we can feel, but pleasure is much more than that, and that's what we're getting in today. Starting with theories of pleasure. Did you know that there are theories of pleasure? Do you think it's just a feeling that human beings have and it has not been studied? Well, you're kind of right. Pleasure was not studied for a long time in the history of academia. It was seen as a superficial subject. It was seen as a personal subject, an embarrassing subject to study. But that all changed in the 1980s. That's how recent it is before pleasure started to be studied. In the 1980s, scholars did start to look at pleasure. Various scholars in my field, we're going to cover some of them today. They're looking at how pleasure is constructed by the media, and they're looking at how pleasure functions in particular contexts in the media. One of the first people to look at pleasure is a scholar we've already studied, Roland Barthes, Barthes. He's a French philosopher. And he wrote a book in 1975 called The Pleasure of the Text. And in this book, he describes three concepts that help us analyze pleasure in all kinds of messages, but including media messages. So the first concept he looks at is plaisir. Plaisir. That's the French word for pleasure. Plaisir. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. I have 3 years of French. Plaisir, or plaisir, as it might be pronounced by a Parisian, is a comfortable pleasure that comes from passive interaction with the text. Passive interaction. Now think back to last class, and we're talking about different ways that you can read a text being media content, not just reading, but watching, listening, typing on the web. That's all reading. There are different ways you can, like resistive reading. Remember we talked about that last time. So we're continuing on with the ways that human beings should position themselves when they take on media texts, position themselves using a theoretical framework. So plaisir is one of the ways that readers are positioned, and they're passive. They're passive when they're getting pleasure. It's a comfortable kind of pleasure. It is also a hegemonic pleasure. A hegemonic pleasure, do you remember what hegemony is, right? That's where one ideology subverts all the others, and you start to believe that this ideology is the supreme ideology and the other ones are not as important. For example, we don't even question that our society is built around cars and vehicles and roads. So our towns are divided up. You have highways going in the middle of people. You have streets where people could be walking or flowers could be planted. When we go to cross the road, the priority is given to the car. If you're the pedestrian, you feel like you have to walk fast. That's a whole ideology that has superseded all the other ways that we could organize our surroundings. For example, if you go to other countries, they have precincts in the cities. Do you know what a precinct is? That's where no cars are allowed, pedestrians only. It's mainly shopping plazas. You can find them all over Europe. That's another ideology, but the car ideology has become the hegemonized ideology. It's pushed down all the other ways of thinking so that we don't even question it anymore. And so hegemonic pleasure is sort of the pleasure that we receive because the producers of the media content are tapping into very common feelings that everybody who's watching or listening to or reading the media content are going to feel. It's a very non-threatening kind of pleasure. It's like watching a film. It was a nice Disney film. It was a nice light film, some laughs in there. That's pleasure. Then there's a second kind of pleasure and that Barth writes about. This is called jouissance. Jouissance. Jouissance, French words. And this is about bliss, ecstasy, or even orgasm. So this is a different kind of pleasure than the last pleasure. This is a more ecstatic and disruptive pleasure. It disrupts what's going on because you have active engagement with the text. It actually functions, this kind of pleasure, jouissance pleasure, as a counter-hegemonic pleasure because you're disrupting the hegemony. You're playing a video game, for example, and you're destroying whole cities, as you might be doing in Minecraft. That's an example of jouissance pleasure. On YouTube, there is, I'm sad to say, a large genre called street fight videos. And that's where you mainly have racial street fighting going on between ordinary citizens, mostly men, mostly black and white men fighting with each other. If you Google street fights, you'll find tons of YouTube videos on it. What kind of pleasure are people getting from that? Are they feeling that they have been wronged in their life, that they've been harmed, and so they want to see somebody else suffer from physical punishment? Is that what it's about? Is it just the specter of it is so bizarre, having two people just because they're different races fighting? Is that the pleasure? Barth might say this is jouissance. It's a counter-hegemonic pleasure. If you see a video that's been put on between two people fighting, maybe the original intent is for you to see how sad it is that two people are fighting and all the people gathering around. But the pleasure that a person may twist out of it, and I say twist not that they're demented or deviant, but they're twisting the hegemonic pleasure, is they're getting pleasure out of seeing somebody else pummeled, seeing somebody else bleeding, seeing somebody else totally defeated. Jouissance. You can think about that for yourself. And then finally, Barth talked about media erotics. Media erotics. And these are actions that occur between the person who's taking in media and the media content. The interactions that take place are described as different kinds of media erotics. The first one being transgression. Transgression is where action takes place that breaks the prevailing codes and conventions. And it requires resistive reading to go through this process of transgression. This is, for example, as I mentioned before, where you're looking at Disney and you're not looking at wholesome values. Instead, you're trying to look for subliminal advertising. You're trying to find in The Lion King the giant penis in the sky that's amongst a bunch of stars. You're really doing this knowing that Disney has a wholesome image and that most people think of Disney almost as like a second religion in our country and imparting values to people. And here you are finding something that would be considered to be perverse in Disney content. You can go look it up yourself. You can find it. That would be resistive reading. You're fighting against the Disney narrative. You're transgressing the Disney text. Another media erotic term that Barth describes is productive. Productive, these are erotic interactions that generate alternative pleasures and meanings. And so it's a kind of resistive reading, but the source of the productive pleasure is that you're coming up with alternative pleasures and meanings. Let's say, for example, that you are a gamer, and let's say that you are destroying something. It could be a person, it could be a tank, it could be a city. Let's say that what you're really getting pleasure from is not the actual devastation and destruction that you're causing. You're getting pleasure from the sounds of the arms. You're getting pleasure from the sound of the machine gun, the sound of the grenade, the sound of the laser, whatever it is. It's giving you an auditory pleasure. That might be considered an alternative pleasure, a pleasure that was not intended by the original authors. So Barth says that sensuous, transgressive, and productive ways the audiences interact with texts also involve other terms such as the taboo. The taboo, that's That's what's off limits. That's what is not accepted within society's conventions for what is expected to derive normal pleasure. Now, I'm going to leave you to think of these things on your own, but think of the deviant pleasures, so-called deviant pleasures that you have in your life, what you get pleasure out of when you interact with media that you'd rather not talk about publicly, that you want to think about to yourself. And are they pleasures that you're not talking about because you would be seen as immoral or unethical or strange or weird or othering? You're not within the norm. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about taboo, talking about taboo pleasures. That's part of the pleasure, right? It's off limits, right? So pleasure and media erotics involve subjective desires. Only you can explain them. Only you can understand them if you can understand them, and they are unique to you. And it's not simply just an innate desire to produce pleasure. It's that individualized within all of us, we have desires for pleasure that are only explainable by ourselves. Now let's move on now to transgressive texts. We want to understand what this means a little bit more. Transgressive texts are texts that are being interpreted. We're still focusing on the audience today. We started that with our last two classes. So being interpreted heavily by the audience is actively involved. So here's different ways that texts can be transgressive. One is if a text is a writerly text. What this refers to is when it was created by the author, it's unfinished, and it invites the audience to co-create. So there's a missing piece to the text, and the audience therefore steps in. Like any time a swear word is bleeped out on radio, anytime you hear a song bleeped out, what happens? I wrote an article about this. I wrote an article about how our FCC law actually creates what it was designed to avoid, and that is to expose people to really vivid meanings of sexual things and bodily part excretions. And you do that when you say, "I don't give a flying f," and you bleep it out, because the audience is invited by that step. The audience is invited by that to fill in the blanks. It's like a crossword puzzle. It's like, here, fill in this fun crossword puzzle, see if you can do it. That is a writerly text. Authors and texts with missing information just for that reason. Look at Google as a search engine. The reason that it became successful very early on compared to other search engines is because it was extremely plain. All it was Google and a search box. There were no links around the side like some of the other original search engines like Alta Vista, if you've ever heard of that one. Tons of links. Google was very simple. So there was a lot of space on the Google page. In other words, a lot of opportunity for the audience, the users, to fill that in with their minds. They were invited by this writerly text of Google. Next up is intertextuality. Intertextuality, this is ways that a text creates other text. So the producer of one text may make reference to another text. Let's take any Marvel comics film, Marvel film. Almost all those films have a reference to other Marvel films and other characters in other films, like the Avengers. They're referring to other Marvel films. This is intertextuality. You will find that in comedians. Comedians make jokes all the time about other people who are in the media. You're getting pleasure from listening to a comedian joke about Dwayne Johnson or whoever. That's pleasure, but there's intertextuality that's part of that pleasure. Next up is a transgressive text that's called polyphony. Polyphony. And if you break down that word, poly means many, phony means sound. And so you've got many voices. That's what polyphony means. And it's like if you look at a film, and at different points in the film, it's being narrated by the wife, the husband, the son, the daughter, the next door neighbor. The voices that you actually hear and the camera angle that's showing are showing it as if you're in their head and you're looking at the environment, and the narrative that you hear, the dialogue, is coming from you being inside of their heads. That's an example of how media content can create many voices of a text. It's that the narrative speaks with many different characters, and you're in the place of those characters. Next up as a transgressive text is carnivalesque text. Carnivalesque text. That's text that embodies feasts, like lots of eating, not like indulging eating, not like proper eating, like engorging eating. So that's carnivalesque text. Festivals, people getting together, celebrating music, pageantry, clothes, rituals, everything that goes along with festivals. And it has kind of a revelry feeling to revelry. It's like a medieval carnival feeling in a way. Any zombie film is going to have this kind of characteristic to it. It's going to have a carnivalesque quality to it, where things are going crazy, things are going haywire, and there's spectacle to it as well. And that takes us now to our last transgressive text, and that is grotesque realism. Grotesque realism. And this is where there's an aesthetic that brings pleasure to people that involves the degradation or debasement. So a human being is usually what's being degraded here, and that brings pleasure. So a grotesque body, for example, is used to be shown in carnivals, polluted, disfigured. Bodies that some people find pleasure with through sadomasochism, or feces, or urine, or sperm, or menstrual blood. These are pleasures for some people, and it's what's called grotesque realism. You know, I remember seeing a painting that was done in the 17th century in Belgium, and this painting depicted the royal family on a balcony, and they were all wearing their clothes, which were so ornate and befitting of royalty, gold-lined collars and silk clothing, and their hair in wigs or makeup all over them. They were standing on the balcony. What were they doing? They had their pants down, all of them, and they were peeing on the average citizens below. Now, this would have been political commentary in the 1700s. There were no newspapers, right? So it was a painting, an artist who was trying to display that royal people, they don't care about the common citizen. They don't care about non-royals. It was, in a way, a kind of grotesque piece of artwork, according to our definition here in transgressive text, because you had the degradation not only of the common citizen by being peed on, but also of the royal family, the royal family members who are supposed to be dignified, and here they are with their pants down. So grotesque realism sometimes involves a term that's called abjection, and that is what disturbs the identity or the system or the order of the society that you're in. It both at the same time captivates you and also repulses you. It's like when you're driving on a highway and you see a car accident, you see an ambulance, and you see a stretcher. You'd rather not see somebody hurt, right? But still you slow down. And still you want to see if you can figure out who caused the accident, how hurt somebody is. That's a way of gaining pleasure through abjection. And then finally, grotesque realism, as it's called, is seen through uncrowning. And this is where you degrade that which is lofty, particularly lofty and particularly high. It's uncrowning. It's even got that metaphor of taking a crown off of a royal family. And the example I gave you, the painting, is a good example of that. Next up, we have transgressive practices. So we've got texts. Now we've got transgressive practices because we're trying to practice erotic analysis. It's a disruptive kind of media criticism. So the practice involves the following. As the audience activity increases, so does the potential for erotic interaction with the text. As your involvement in the text increases, so too does the erotic pleasure that you can get from it. And this involves what we call interpretive play. It's sort of an improvisational mode of audience text interaction that ignores the dominant hegemonic codes. And instead what you're doing is one of the three following things if you're involved in a transgressive practice. You're cruising. Now, that's a term that's used in the gay world for males that go out cruising for partners. But this is different in this text. It's talked about how the body is on the lookout for its own desire. And that's what you're doing. You're on the lookout for pleasure. You're on the lookout for satisfying that desire with pleasure. You're ready, right? You're cruising. You're looking around. So you're open. You're open to being pleased. Next up is drifting. Drifting is generating highly personal associates with the text. So what you're doing is you're not daydreaming, but you're trying to find in the text something where it connects with you very, very strongly. There's something about the text that personally you can relate to because of experiences you've had in the past. Again, I'm going to leave that one up to you since it's such a personal pleasure. And lastly, we have skimming. Skimming is reading purposefully. Now, when I say reading, I don't mean reading with your eyes. I mean interpreting text. That's what I mean. It's not really respecting the whole. It's looking at important themes. That's what you do often when you study for a test, right? And you want to try and really identify those key terms in a chapter that you think are going to be asked about on the exam. So you don't read the whole chapter, you skim. You skim, right? That's how that term is used there. I was skimming this morning when I was looking at that CNN report, listening to it while I was getting ready. I had it playing over here. I wasn't totally focused on it. I was brushing my teeth and stuff. I was listening for NATO. I was skimming for NATO so that I could get some pleasure. Next up is the concept of immersion. Immersion is where you want to escape the boundaries of everyday life, so you throw yourself into the media content as if it is a real world. The boundaries of your real life are gone, and you become another person, right? That's what fishing is all about, right? When you go online, you take on another character, and it may not even be fishing. It may just be that you have another name for yourself on your profile. Isn't that what you're doing? You're immersing yourself in this alternate reality. You're putting yourself in, you're leaving behind the boundaries of you're no longer Joe Smith or Mary Jones. You're this new person now. And then finally, we have performance. Performance is experimentation with alternative identities. And this is happening all the time on social media, where people are experimenting with alternate identities. I've seen people come out on Facebook as gay. I've seen people transition from male to female or female to male on Facebook. This is about experimenting with alternative identities, at least at one level, in the use of media content. And now this takes us finally to a term that we want to describe, that describes you as an audience member. And that term is very important in understanding how pleasure is sought from the text. It's talking about user-created text. That's the term that I want to highlight now, user-created text. That's where the audience creates the text. So there may be an original post on Facebook, but the really more interesting stuff is what everybody commented afterwards. That's an example of user-created text. If you're watching Dancing with the Stars and you take your phone and you text in who should be voted off the show, that is user-created text. You are contributing in the text. You're posting a video on YouTube, that is user-created text. User-created text highlights that the audience member is actively involved in the text and therefore is more likely to get erotic pleasure. Which takes us to our final concept for today, which is fandom. I have a colleague in the department, Dr. Charlie Warner. This is his specialty, studying fans and fandom in the context of popular culture. What fans are? Fans are short for fanatic, right? So fans are organized communities of people with a special affinity or attachment to a media text. You may think of fans as sports fans or music fans or other kinds of pop culture fans. Fans are really just communities that have a special affinity for a text. And they participate in the cultural production of that text. They participate through semiotic productivity. And that's where the uses of symbols in the text are what they are connecting to. All of you know right away what these three letters are because you go to this university and you don't even have to study them because you are part of the semiotic productivity that goes on at the university by virtue of being at the university, and that leads you to hopefully be a fan of the university as well. Then we also have enunciative productivity. It's a different kind of productivity. That's where fans publicly debate and discuss their shared interests. There's a whole huge discussion going on right now whether Tom Brady should have come out from retirement. That's being talked about. There's a whole huge discussion going on now about whether LeBron James is better than Michael Jordan. There's a whole huge discussion going on now about whether Britney Spears is acting up because she's out of her conservatorship. This is enunciative productivity. It's where the fans start to discuss and share their interests and seek pleasure, and that is very easily done on social media. And then finally, we have textual productivity. Textual productivity. These are actually products that fans create. I'm a huge fan of the Rolling Stones. The Rolling Stones just announced their 60th anniversary tour in Europe this summer. I hope to see them somewhere along the way. There's a whole bunch of fans that are making up t-shirts already. Stones t-shirts. There's a whole group of fans called the Shadoobies, named after a line in one of the Rolling Stones songs called Shattered. And the Shadoobies are constantly making up shirts and buttons and other kinds of stuff that have to do with the Rolling Stones. It's textual productivity, and it brings pleasure, just like many of the other items that we've talked about in today's instructor video. So I hope that brings you to a conclusion about where your pleasure is coming from, and also opens up some more questions, because in many ways, you never really know. Have a great day.